In this video, I'm going to show you how to get started with the Infragistics Net Advantage ASP.NET WebGauge control. So here I have a basic ASP.NET application set up in Visual Studio, and I have a web form with the main div on the form where the content will be placed. So I'm going to go and click on the Visual Studio toolbox, locate the Net Advantage ASP.NET toolset, and locate the UltraGauge control in this Net Advantage toolbox tab. So I will double click that to get an instance of the web server control on the form. And one thing I want to show you is the assembly references that are added to the application. So if I right click in the Solution Explorer and the project itself, I'm going to go to the property pages. You will see we have the Infragistics WebUI.shared assembly reference and the Infragistics WebUI.ultraWebGauge assembly reference. These two are the basic assemblies required in order to use this control on the form. So I'm just going to resize this gauge control, make it a little bit bigger, and if we take a quick look at the source, we're going to notice that we have the register directives referencing the assemblies and namespaces that are needed. Here we have a very simple UltraGauge definition on the form. So it's quite easy to get started with this control. So one of the things you can do to get started is select a preset, and we'll do that in this video. And it's also great to learn how the various objects are within the object model, so this is a great starting point. So if I click on choose a preset, I will get a drop down with essentially 101 presets. There's quite a bit of them in here. So we could start off with this one. We'll go with a very basic linear gauge, where the linear gauge in itself is pretty much like a straight up and down or horizontally oriented gauge control, where there's a range of values and then a marker that moves up and down, very similar to a thermometer. So in this particular preset, we have several things going on here. So when I say this is great for learning the API of the control itself, you could click on the control and then go through the properties window to see how this works. So as we take a look down the object model, anything that's bold is pretty much a property setting that's applied by the preset. So we have several collection type properties we can look at. The annotations, let's start with that one. So I click on that and notice that we have various box annotations, and you might ask, what are these? Well, essentially these are the text areas that show up. So take a look. This one, if I expand the label property, you notice that it says low, and it's right here. If I go all the way to the top here, we expand it, and it says severe. So this is one of the features of the gauge control. You could add annotations that indicate various bits of information, or they could call out an exceptional situation within the gauge itself. So they could be used many different ways, and in this situation we're just applying text at various ranges of the gauge. And notice how the annotations themselves are placed on the actual control. The bounds property is what is used to set where it's located. So we give it a width and height of 100 and 100, and we give it an x and y value. And now, are these pixel points, or are they relative, or what are these? Well, the actual bounds measure property is what dictates that. So you have the ability to allow these to be treated as values such as pixels or percent. So if I move the pixels, notice how it moves up towards the top and it changes that. So let's put it back to percent. So notice how we have two of them. That's how we get that little shadow effect. That's how it, so you have like it's white, then we have like a slightly offset background where it's dark. That's a cool trick, again, from the great minds of our visual design team and graphics design experts on staff here. And you get all these 101 presets. So that's the annotations collection. So as we scroll down, we go down to a very important part of the API, the gauges collection. Because remember, the gauge control by itself is a web server control that's empty and has nothing to start off with. And the gauges collection allows you to add as many gauges of various types, such as linear gauge, digital gauge, radial gauges, all just thrown into this collection and positioned in the same exact way you position these annotations. So that's where you're able to come up with really complex and compelling gauges with multiple gauge types all arranged next to each other or overlaid on each other to make it look like a really custom and complex um, instrumentation gauge. So the linear gauge is what's been added in this collection. So we have only one gauge, and adding other gauges is as simple as clicking on the add button and adding radial gauge, linear gauge, or segmented digital gauge. So if I added another radial gauge, I could set a bunch of properties for that. So let's keep it with whatever we have in the preset right now. Now, more work will be spent on the linear gauge itself, or every other gauge in the actual gauges collection. So the bounds are set as default, so that means it pretty much takes up the entire control. The brush elements, so the brush element essentially is what's used to style it with colors and gradients. So here's some additional things that we can look at. So color stops are set up in this. So as you can see from this editor that shows up, we have various color stops. We have one here which is red, yellow, and green, and that's what essentially gives us this morphing color effect. And then we have another one, and if we take a look at the color stops collection, notice that we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 stops here. And again, these are just the various APIs that we give you in order to style and come up with really wonderful look and feel to your actual control. So the corner extent, notice it's 5. If I change it to 0, what happens? Well, now we have sharp corners. So if you concentrate and look in this area, I'll set it back to 5, and that's basically a radius. That's a radius type of value. So the higher the number, the bigger the radius is. So if I go to 10, we're going to have really rounded corners. That looks nicer, I think. The orientation is what dictates whether it's going to be horizontal or vertical. So because of the size of this, if I wanted to make this work in the horizontal orientation, I would have to resize the control so that it's long across the x-axis and short on the y-axis. So bring it back to vertical so the actual needle moves up and down the way it's supposed to. The scales collection is another important item, so let's click on that, and you notice we have one scale. So you could add as many scales as you like. I could add a bunch of them. So scales essentially represent areas where a needle can move, and they could have start and end value. So if I start off by clicking on, well, first the start extent and end extent dictates where it will be drawn on the actual gauge. So if I do, let's say 50, you're going to notice that that's where, you know, the actual scale is going to start at this 50 location, and that's kind of a percentage of where on the control it renders. So let's go back to 9, and the end extent as well. So if we click on this labels collection or this labels property, and we expand it, notice that we also configure it by giving it an extent value, and then we pretty much specify the Z positioning, or in other words the Z order, or like, do you want the actual scale to show up above the labels or below the labels, or above the mark? So the Z position property essentially dictates where you want the scale to show above the actual markers in the control or below the markers. So it's kind of like send to back, send to front. That's what this essentially does. Then major tick marks. So every time you see the word extent, like start extent, end extent, that pretty much dictates, does it start here and goes up to there, or does it start here and goes up to there? That's pretty much how that works. And the frequency of the tick marks. So notice that the tick marks you don't see any tick marks because they don't have a color. So if I were to just essentially go to this, give it a color, just for the example's sake, you notice the tick marks are here, and you can see them, but we'll reset that one to keep it with the preset. And same thing with minor tick marks. Minor tick marks are in between each one, so we give it, if we actually give it a color. Now let's take a look at the markers collection. Now let's take a look at the markers collection. We have one item in this collection, and here's the needle. You could add a needle or a bar marker. The needle is what you see here, so essentially it's a moving line. A bar marker essentially is something that starts at the bottom and just keeps getting longer and longer, and it's continuous along the line. So you could also have multiple markers in this collection. And again, we have brush element that's set up to give it a color, gradient style, and all styling related properties. So one of the great things about the presets is that all the hard work is done for you. And the other thing that we do is we give it an extent that essentially dictates the positioning. So let's see, if I were to make this, let's see if I do it like 100, you notice how now it's really tiny because it's like so it's from 100 to 120. So if we do like 10, we'll make it really long. So let's maybe do something like halfway. So do 50, so that way we could see the needle really clearly. So they designed the needle so it doesn't go over the text. So again, just to give you an idea, the start extent, so it starts at 50 and ends at 120. So if we do 6, if we make it end at 60, you're gonna notice that that's how they designed it. And it's actually, let's do 120 again, just to give you some ideas on how it works. Okay, so we click OK. We click OK on that and OK on that. And then the next thing we need to do is essentially write some code to set values on this, because eventually we need to set a value. So the way it works is we need to access the needle and give it a value. So I'm going to double click on the form. So we access the gauges collection, so gauge sub 0. So there's a few things that we need to do still before we run this application. So first thing what we have to do is set up a folder on our web application so that images can be written there. So I'm going to right click and add a new folder, and I'm going to name it by default Gauge Images. And the reason why I'm setting this up is if we click on the gauge control and locate the deployment scenario property in the Visual Studio property window, you're going to find an image URL. So it says gauge images and then / this interesting looking string, which is actually parsed by the gauge control itself. We also have different types of modes, so we could deploy to the session and file system. At a later video, I'll modify this example to do a session-based deployment. The other thing we have here is file path, so that has to line up with the name of the folder, so we'll do that. So right off the bat, that's all set up. Now the next thing I need to do is write some code just to set the value of the needle itself. So if I go here and just paste the code in there, I'll show you real quick that we essentially access the gauges collection. We only have one gauge in here. You could also, the other thing you could do is, at runtime, write some initialization code so that you have a couple of variables that directly access each one of the gauges, and then you have to access the scale, the appropriate scale within the scales collection, as well as get to the marker, and then just set the value on that. We're just hard coding a value here on the page load. So if I run this application, we notice that we have value of 5 set, and say if we do like 1 and run it again. You could also set this up so that you could set up some polling, so you could poll your data and it'll automatically set it. You could also put this inside of a refresh panel, so you can make AJAX requests to poll for the data and have it automatically update without reloading the entire page for this operation. So that's pretty much what you need to know to get started to create your basic gauge enabled application. And remember, we have 101 presets to choose from, and there's so many of them that definitely at least one of them has to be able to give you a great starting point, and then you could further customize them using the techniques that I showed you before, just iterating through or going through the properties, customizing them, looking at the design time mode to see what changes your property modifications have on the control, and then just sticking with it. Thanks for watching.
Infragistics. On the web at infragistics.com.